became an expert on U.S. energy policy. Jay went on, I didn't know until this morning, that he was chief of staff for Governor Grant of Florida. He was the administrator of the Energy Information Administration during the Clinton administration. He was director for research and policy for President Obama's BP Deepwater Horizon Oil Spill Commission. He spent more than 13 years as the director of the Jimmy Carter Presidential Library. So a long and distinguished career in public service, and still a political scientist. He was keynote speaker at the recent Tulane Energy Forum, and his earlier books included A Declaration of Energy Independence, published in 2015, and Energy Crises, Nixon, Ford, Carter, and Hard Choices in the 1970s, was published in 2021. Today, Jay will talk to us about his latest book, published by the LSU Press in August of this year, The Presidents and the Planet, Climate Change, Science, and Politics from Eisenhower to Bush. Jay will be signing copies of his book after today's program. We'll use those tables in the back where the name tags are. Octavia Books has said they would send a representative to sell copies of the book for Jay, that Jay will be signing. I give you my former UNO colleague, Dr. Jay Hakes.
Great to see a pretty full room today. I greatly value my days at UNO. I was here from 1970 to 1977. I'm very proud that I was on the faculty basketball team. My teammates included Steve Ambrose and Nick Mueller, who you probably have heard of. And so when I went to work for Jimmy Carter, I took a 2-year leave of absence, and I came back and saw the Dean of Liberal Arts, Cooper Mackin, and said, I don't think I'm coming back. And he said, well, we've never in the history of the university granted a 3rd-year leave of absence. And I said, well, I'll make it easy for you. I'm not going to apply for one. So I left the most tenured of professions into the world of politics and government, which is the least tenured, because even if your person you're working for gets reelected, they may be term limited. So I've never been unemployed for a day, but I've had a lot of different jobs. And when I retired from full-time employment in 2013, I counted up, and I had testified before Congress, I think, on 26 occasions on energy. I had lectured in 11 foreign countries about energy, including probably 20 lectures in China. So I felt like I retired at the age of 69. I said, there's 2 books that need to be written, and if nobody else is going to write them, I'm going to write them. And one of them was about the energy crisis of 1970, which I judge all probably had some experience in the gasoline line of that period. And to my mind, nobody had ever explained it very well. And so I went back and got the actual data. The best data was at the AAA headquarters in Orlando, and they've thrown it all away since I used it. So if people want to get the data from that time, they write me. And also I had the previously classified discussions between the United States and Saudi Arabia, which were extremely insightful. And so that book came out. The new book, I think, is my best book, and it's about the issue of climate change. So climate change may be controversial. I don't think it's really all that controversial. Basically, the International Energy Agency projects that if we see that we have, well, they say that we have greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere and it traps heat. And I don't think that anybody sort of argues with that. It raises the temperature of the Earth, not evenly, but on average quite a bit. And that has a couple of effects. It raises sea level. It also dehydrates soils away from the coast, which we're seeing the effects of that in California. It makes storms more severe. Doesn't seem like it's causing more hurricanes, but it's causing them to behave somewhat differently. And it also leads to migration pressures where people whose land may be not useful for agricultural anymore, and they want to move, and maybe there's some better land someplace else, but it's not easy these days to relocate around the world. So we are headed, according to the International Energy Agency, to 2.5 degrees Celsius sometime in this century, and a temperature rise. And that is in Celsius. So a lot of us aren't scientists. So in Fahrenheit, that's 4.5 degrees. And that's assuming that we continue to make progress at the level that we've been making it so far. And that could go up or could go down depending on what we as humans decide to do about it. So my feeling is that to understand where we might be going, which is always a bit iffy. Yogi Berra used to say it's really hard to make predictions, particularly about the future. Sometimes the best thing to do is try to figure out how we got to where we are today. And that helps us a little bit look at what the future might be. Now, I felt like there was a huge gap in understanding climate change science and politics because it didn't go back far enough. Because people who are writing books today get their information off the internet. Well, I have news for you. The Netscape browser didn't come out until the early 1990s. So there's a ton load of stuff before that hasn't been digitized, and it's not on the internet. It's in documents and files and archives. And also the people who were there at the time are not living. So if you're using oral interviews, you can only go back so far. So someone had to go to the archives of the scientists and spend weeks going through their papers, go to the presidential libraries and go through previously classified material or other material that just no one had looked at, to try to piece together the whole story. And so a lot of people were starting saying, well, we got in, the political establishment was told about climate change in 1988. And that's been published a lot of places, peer-reviewed journals by experts. And I knew that was nowhere near close to being the case. Basically, when Carter was president, there were about 5 reports that came out at the time that all agreed with each other about kind of what would happen. And it's kind of what we experience today. They were actually pretty accurate. Now, I would say, having worked in the Carter administration, I wasn't particularly aware of it at the time. There's a lot going on. So, the fact that someone was talking about climate change doesn't mean that a lot of people were listening, because they were dealing with a whole host of problems. So then people who study climate change said, well, actually, there was quite a substantial report on climate change that was produced by the Lyndon Johnson White House in '65. So if a few people knew that. So before my research for my book, that was sort of the standard point, Lyndon Johnson. Now my book starts in the 50s. So I'm out in the archives of Roger Rebel in California. If you don't know about Roger Rebel, my basic argument is that someday he should be treated in the science textbooks that our kids study, kind of like Copernicus or Galileo. They discovered that the Earth circulates around the sun doesn't circulate around the Earth. And so we learn about Copernicus and Galileo. What Roger Rebel found out was that the carbon dioxide just didn't sink into the ocean. which was the predominant view of scientists until the mid-1950s. So he's the great climate scientist. So I'm going through his papers, and I see a letter from the John Kennedy White House speechwriting office. You may remember Ted Sorensen, who wrote speeches for Kennedy. I think he's the last of the major White House figures that I've actually met. I've met him a couple of times. And it's thanks Revell for advising Kennedy on a speech. I thought, well, this is pretty amazing. I've gone through all of Kennedy's speeches to see if there was anything about climate change using word search, and those things are digitized. I better go back and look at that speech. So I find out that Kennedy's science advisor was a friend of Revell. Revell helped rewrite the speech, and it said, we must devote more resources to study the interaction between the atmosphere and the oceans, because this interaction affects our climate. Now, that was the gist. It doesn't use the word carbon. It doesn't use the word climate change. It will use the word climate, but not climate change. But it was basically working off of Revell's 1955 article. So I started digging more, and I find, going through the Kennedy papers and other things that I could scrape together, that Revell actually advised Kennedy on 3 speeches when he was president. And in one of them is actually in a film that Kennedy did, and the only person in the film is Roger Revell. And then a couple of weeks before his assassination, President Kennedy was speaking at the 100th anniversary of the National Academy of Sciences. And he repeats the statement about the interaction between the atmosphere and the ocean. And if you look closely in the pictures, they're all in academic garb. Revell's right back there. So a lot of people who've read my books, including experts on climate change, I didn't know much about Revell. In fact, I gave a lecture several weeks ago at the University of California, San Diego, which basically Revell founded, and one of the colleges there is named Roger Revell College. And the provost of the college invited me to speak at the 60th anniversary of the founding of the school, because he didn't know much about Revell. Most everybody had forgotten about him, and he's one of the most important people in the history of science. So, in my opinion. So, going back to the 50s, we find that Revell figures out the theoretical basis of climate change. He does it at this 1955 meeting, 99 years after there was a paper delivered at the American Association for the Advancement of Science that was the first scientist that discovered that carbon dioxide trapped heat. I bet you there is no one in this room, and this is a very highly educated audience, who has had the advantage of going to having great professors and going to good schools. I bet you nobody can name the person who discovered that carbon, and it's not what you learned in high school. See, Eunice Foote, and this shows us how much we don't know about history. Eunice Foote was a suffragette in upper state New York, and fighting for the right of women to vote. And she makes a discovery at home. She's an amateur scientist, and demonstrates this. And you go back to the journal of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, which in later years was headed by Mary Good, former chemistry professor at UNO. It's there, and that has been digitized. So you can go on the web and find it. Eunice Foote, here's the article. Till about 10 years ago, nobody ever mentioned it. So there is a need for, I think, the kind of book that I'm doing that goes back and says, hey, Kennedy was involved in this. I can document that Eisenhower's advisors were on it, were aware of the issue. So this gives us a whole different view. And it's kind of fun. Revell has kind of been forgotten now. He was a slow. I mean, when he was in the Kennedy administration, when they formed the Peace Corps, President Kennedy appointed him to be on the advisory committee for the Peace Corps, including Lyndon Johnson, a Supreme Court justice, Harry Belafonte, passed away recently. So he was moving and shaking with and he was in the Johnson White House all the time. So this is a big surprise. One of the better podcasts I've done in the last couple of months is entitled "The Untold Story of Climate Change, Science, and Politics." And the host of it, Bill Lovelace, who's a very veteran energy reporter, he teaches energy journalism at Columbia now. His editor balked at that title and said, "How do you know this is unknown?" And Bill said, "If Jay and I don't know about it, nobody knows about it." And it's turned out the case. I mean, I made that claim when I wrote the book, and I haven't yet to meet one person that's told me, "Oh, I already knew that." So what are some of the other surprises that are in the book? And I'll be glad to answer questions. And I see Tom from the wonderful Octavia Books is here. If you haven't been to the new Octavia Books, how many of you have seen the updated decor there? Octavia Books. It is spectacular. And so drop by there all the time. And it's a great place to buy Christmas presents, actually. So there's some other surprises in the book, and I can only scratch the surface. So I'll give you two that I think illuminate sort of what we're dealing with. Once the scientists sort of figure out what they think is going on, then the political establishment has to kind of deal with it. And there is a line of thought that we've never done anything about it. So when did the first actual concrete steps start to take place where the government was actually passing policies that had climate implications? And it turns out, kind of to my surprise, when I write books, I don't write just to confirm what I already knew. I want to solve the puzzle and figure out what I didn't understand. The big push came in the second term of Ronald Reagan. Now, Ronald Reagan has a reputation as being an anti-environmental president. But if you look carefully, there's a big difference between Reagan's first term and his second term. In the second term, he didn't have the same people around that he had in the first term. His head of EPA was very aggressive on climate change. His Secretary of State, George Shultz, who's a name that probably is familiar to some of you, he was big for doing something about climate change. And there was a bipartisan bloc in the Senate that supported the environment and was large enough that they could override presidential veto. The leader of this group, in my opinion, now Al Gore was very involved. Al Gore, incidentally, was a student of Roger Goodell. Roger Goodell went and taught at Harvard for a while. And in December, I actually have the syllabus from the course, and I've interviewed both of the assistants to the course. Ravel gave a lecture on climate change, and it changed Gore's life, basically. So, but anyhow, the leader, when Reagan is president, is a guy named John Shafee. I bet you not many people here remember John Shafee. War hero in World War II, Secretary of the Navy, Rhode Island, from Rhode Island, yes. And his son became prominent in politics. But he was head of the Environment Committee, and he was actually more specific about what to do about climate change than Al Gore was. So at the time, when they would send a letter to Reagan, it would, if it had 12 Democrats, it'd have 12 Republicans. If it had 15 Republicans, it'd have 15 Democrats. This was not an accident. They wanted to show, and they actually did one time override Reagan's veto on an environmental issue. And after that, Reagan generally got ahead of the curve and went along with things. So what did they do? They passed the first meaningful appliance efficiency standards for things like air conditioners and refrigerators. And then, of course, at the state and local level, people are adopting better housing codes, which are generally more energy efficient. So if we say we've done nothing, well, no, over the years, we've been doing some things in that area. We also, the United States led the move to establish the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. That happened when Reagan was president. And then there was the Montreal Protocol, where the nations of the world agreed to protect the ozone layer. And that's pretty important because without the ozone layer, we all get skin cancer. So we have, that's been one of the great successes in politics of addressing that issue. We're still not quite back to where we want to be, but we made a lot of progress. So those things all happen. And it's interesting though, there's been a lot of books come out this year about climate change. So mine came out on August 5th, and I was the first person to really talk about Chafee and his role in environmental history. August 6th, one day later, a book comes out, published by written by one of his former staffers, which includes a lot of stuff about John Chafee. So now there's two books out there that talk about Chafee. Then I would argue that in Bush the father, who in many ways was viewed as being more pro-environment than Reagan, and in certain areas was, but on climate change, he and his top people didn't want to deal with it. They opposed measures to deal with it, and they broke up the coalition. There's a turning point that nobody else has really pointed to, but in the early 90s, after Iraq invaded Kuwait, there was a move to have stricter automobile efficiency standards. And this had sort of been coming along anyway, but it seemed like the timing was really great to really ramp them up. And so it had to get by the filibuster in the Senate. So there were two procedural votes. On the first vote, it easily passed the 60 vote threshold. So it looked like we were going to do this. The White House and the auto industry and the auto unions and basically a lot of other people put tremendous pressure on the Senate. And when the second procedural vote came, I think it only got like 57 votes. So it was done. So we didn't do automobile efficiency standards again until 2007. So this, to me, is kind of a turning point because there had been this momentum. Now, this story, and I argue that we have to have this is a global pollutant. It stays in the atmosphere for over 100 years. So we have to have a great historical perspective. We have to have a global perspective. And someday, human race will get a report card on how did the human race handle this. And based on what I have said so far, it sounds kind of bleak in a way because we haven't done nothing, but we haven't done enough. So to keep us from getting to fairly calamitous levels. So there's a couple other streams in the book. The book is written as a chronological story about the people that were involved in this, but there's a string of economic analysis. What were the economists getting right? What were they getting wrong? And then there's the advance of technology. So just about the same time that Revell is publishing his initial findings, you have the first civilian nuclear power plant in Pennsylvania, which is a zero carbon energy source. And then at that time, the major research on photovoltaic solar cells was being done by Bell Labs. And they discovered that the solar cells worked a lot better if you didn't use vacuum tubes and you used transistors based on silicon. And so they advanced it. And then when Carter came in, it was pedal to the metal on solar energy. And the scientists were saying, we really appreciated this because at the time, solar was viewed as a hippie thing. So we really started doing it. And then at different points, we pull back, and Japan would keep working on it, or Germany would keep working on it. China now is bringing down cost. So we are in a different era, and we have tools that we didn't have before. So I have a picture in 2017 in the book of Carter and his grandson Jason with Carter's biggest grin I've ever seen him have, and I've spent a lot of time. It is the opening of a 10-acre solar farm on his own peanut land, Plains, Georgia. And in 2017 is kind of a turning point. And it was being sponsored by an industry group that probably wasn't aware that Carter was the one who really pushed solar. And he's a very devout Baptist, as was my father. And so he couldn't brag about it. So he insisted that they include me as the keynote speaker because he knew I, if you're modest, that's the way you do that. So, but it just, that was symbolic in a way, but that was the crossing point of when solar became economic and competitive. And MIT did a study a few years ago, and over a 40-year period, the price of solar energy had come down 99%. Now, I always pause to say that is not a typo, or it's not an old person's slip of the tongue. 99% is what it is, and the cells are more efficient. In other words, they can get more energy from a certain square footage. So that is sitting there, and I've sort of closed the book with that because a lot of books are on climate change can be a little bit depressing. But the next frontier, and one of the things I stressed at the Tulane Energy, was it last week or the week before? Get confused. Was the next horizon is batteries, because right now we live in a hurricane-prone area. So they'll say, "Wow, man, this car has 250 miles range." Well, I'm thinking, the last hurricane that I fled, there weren't a lot of hotel spaces available on the road. So I got to get to my son's house in Tallahassee, and that's 380. Well, 5 to 10 years, these cars are going to have range of 400. So that kind of battle. And then now, both North Carolina and Georgia have recently announced big solar farms, like 65 megawatts, plans for bigger ones. Batteries can take, when there's a surplus of energy and it's cheap, they can store the energy, they can sell it when it's expensive. They can help balance intermittent sources of energy like wind and solar. And they can react quickly to any changes in the grid. Natural gas besides being cleaner, can respond much quicker than coal, and also responds much quicker than the nuclear plant, which is very hard to turn on and off. But so it might take 10 minutes, to get it up and running. Battery, 0.2 seconds. So the grid's going to work more smoothly. It's going to make it cheaper. Elon Musk will be happy to build the batteries for you. So here we are, and we have to you have to accept the contradictory thing can be true, and that we've had a lot of chances to move faster, and we've had a lot of chances to fumble the ball more. And the book stops its intense research with President Bush, partly because publishers these days don't like to give you more than 120,000 words, and I wanted to make sure that the early history didn't get lost. But I do write a rather long summary at the end that takes it through the Clinton and all the way up to the Inflation Reduction Act. And I would mention that one of the guys, I used to have political speakers in my class here, local, state, and national. And one of them in it had been 1973 was Joe Biden spoke to my classes. So how are we doing that? Okay. I'm willing at this point, before we put Tom to work, hopefully back there, for any questions or comments. I think this is looking at the history gets at some of the basic people and the basic issues. You know, a lot of times the debates that we're having are about fringe issues that are, I regard, somewhat beside me. But any question that you have about it, yes.
A prediction, please. I've been reading about the tremendous energy requirements of Bitcoin mining and artificial intelligence. And companies are putting in great big plans to do blah, 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 blah. What's your prediction about where that's going?
Well, I've actually testified before Congress on a similar issue, and this was data centers, which are kind of, you know, and at the time, there were all sorts of predictions like there are with AI right now about it slow down the grid. And EIA, which I was heading at the time, our calculations were that it would be much lower. And the Berkeley labs, which is a national energy lab, agreed with us, and we turned out to be right. The people who disagreed with me are still writing op-eds all over the place. So I don't know. I am not as hands-on in the analysis, but I think what happens is that one, some of these companies file plans in several different states because they're shopping. Mm-hmm. And so there may not be quite as many of them as we think. Also, like anything else, when something is done over and over again, it gets more efficient, and there's going to be some competition to get more efficient. And some of the AI people, like if you're more on Google, you're not going to want the bad public relations. So you might put in a solar farm or put in somebody, they're talking about small nuclear plants now. So I think it's somewhat exaggerated, but I don't think that they should be allowed to raise consumer prices. You know, traditionally we have given, if you look at the rate structure in most states, industries get a lower rate than you consumers get. And the argument for it is that they can stop doing business if there's a shortage of power. And the threat of AI is we need to run these things 24 hours a day. So they should not be getting any discount. If the utility regulation is appropriately applied, and that's probably a pretty big if, then the problem may not be quite what it looks like. We also have, the automobile sort of shifting its load to the grid. So my kids, I have 2 plugs in my driveway, and my kids across the street have theirs plugged in at night. I have mine plugged in at night. But it's not fully electric because it's a hybrid electric, and so I can drive to Florida to get away from Earth. So I think that's a very important question. On the surface, it looks like it could be a pretty big threat to the need to reduce our emissions, but we'll have to see how it plays out. It could reduce the energy demand in other areas by making certain industries more efficient. My fear is most of the companies I deal with these days believe that if you have an issue, you don't get to ever talk to a human. And with AI, they're going to be even more sure that you never need to talk to a human. And I compete with robots every day on the New York Times World Game. I still think there are areas where humans can do a better job, even than AI. But I tell my granddaughters, who's she's a sophomore when she's only a freshman, but she's coding and working on developing robots and everything. I said, do a good job. Make sure these robots and artificial intelligence have a moral compass. In big trouble. Yes.
It sounds like, in spite of ourselves, in general, we're making progress. It always feels like there's this balancing act, and maybe the net is that we're actually getting somewhere. Is there a separate learning curve for, I don't know, I feel uncomfortable saying at each administration, but as we go through times when different groups of people with different philosophies have power. Is there a general learning curve for all of them, or does each one have to go through its own learning curve? Because I wonder about the people in the past who are negative voices, who have changed their opinions over 1 or 2 or 3 decades. So how does that work?
Well, on your first point, some people have said, not totally facetiously, thank God we had the Arab oil embargo, because that brought us efficiency standards for automobiles. Initially, people became much more, they started obeying the speed limit for a while, and the speed limit those days was 55. So we've done a lot of things that have been helpful for climate for other reasons. The second question is very complex, and I've been invited by publishers several times to split my books into smaller topics, because I sometimes will write a 200,000 page book and the publisher only wants 120. So I've thrown away a lot of good stuff or sitting in my files. But I always want to get the bigger picture, and I want to see how presidents hand off issues to other administrations. And I argued early on that there was relatively little difference between Nixon, Ford, and Carter. Carter was more heavy metal to the pedal kind of guy, but in their basic views towards nuclear power, and all of them had done something to advance solar power. All of them were against price controls and found it difficult to get rid of them. So I didn't want to write a separate book on Carter and a separate book on Ford and all that. So right now, you have, a business system, you have a tax incentive system that will, in some sense, carry forward, in some sense, will not carry forward. There are a lot of soft signals that we send to our own people and to the world of where this ranks as an issue. I'm very proud to say that the Minister for Climate Change and Energy in Australia, on a podcast a couple of weeks ago, identified my book as his favorite book of the year. So it's an international discussion. But if we say to the world, well, this is an important issue that we want to do anything about, this has a lot of ramifications. And it also has ramifications, to open up a whole other thing is, I have delivered many lectures in China. They try to pay me for it. My expenses were paid by the U.S. State Department, and I turned down any payments. But I found that there was a level of attention to what I was saying that I actually don't align in this country. I mean, I see you are all paying close attention, but I actually was invited to speak to the largest provincial Communist Party in China. And this was a last minute thing. And they called in hundreds of delegates. This was Guangdong province, which is huge, and it's the industrial center of China. So they called in about 400 or 500 delegates, and I was the sole attraction. And I thought, they said, we want you to talk for 1 hour and 15 minutes. I said, well, that's good, because with the translator, that means I have to talk for 45 minutes. Right. And it turned out it was the first one where they had simultaneous translation. So I had to talk for the whole hour and a half, and then there were questions. After that was over, I got a call unexpectedly and said, we're scheduling a press conference with you and the governor of Guangdong province. Now, the American consulate there in Guangzhou, the capital city of the province, hadn't been able to schedule a meeting with the governor yet. So he was very happy because now he was going to get to meet the governor. So he and I got up and did a kind of a dialogue about the importance of LED lights, which at that time was kind of one of the leading conservation issues. And he announced how they were going to take the leadership in producing LED lights. Well, this was wonderful because the price of LED lights in this country has been slashed. But their industrial policy is doing certain things, which is in a way threatening, and it's in a way helpful. So how do we deal with that? So there's some stuff on China in the book. It's such a big topic that we've got a separate discussion on that. But the answer to your question is probably it varies from time to time, but in general, there's more continuity between the presidents than we expect because the news media tends to concentrate on where the differences are. And so there's probably a little bit of exaggeration on that. Not to say that the current change is not potentially quite large. Yeah.
What about nuclear? Where's that? What's the future look like there? Because it seems like could be less polluting and beneficial on the climate change front. And there's new technology with these packet plants and things. Is that going to actually get going and come back, or is that just a red herring?
Well, in my opinion, nuclear has demonstrated that it can operate safely. Not everywhere, because again, if regulation is lax, it can be dangerous. But if you look at 3 Mile Island, you got a core meltdown, which is the ultimate disaster. But a nuclear plant traditionally has a concrete containment vessel, which is about 2 to 3 feet of concrete surrounding it. So there was very little radiation escape from the containment vessel. However, nuclear power is very expensive. And it started out being advertised as too cheap to meter. Mm-hmm. But the capital cost of constructing a nuclear plant is very large. And, there was a battle here in New Orleans years ago, and that's led one of the things that the Alliance for Affordable Energy got involved in. And they were looking at the cost, and there was no economic basis for building that plant here, and that plant was eventually stopped. So how would you reduce costs? I was on an advisory committee for the Office of Technology Assessment in the 1980s, and we suggested that they use smaller plants. And the reason you would use a smaller plant is you can mass produce the modules. And so, it's only through mass production that you can bring down cost. So I'm talking about plants that are maximum 250. Well, everybody's talking about this today, but when the subsidies were provided in the 2005 legislation and Georgia Power built their plants, they were each 1,000 megawatts. They were way behind schedule. They came in double. And the nuclear engineers and a lot of good friends of mine, you're advocating these smaller plants. You don't understand economy of scale. And I said, you don't understand the financing of complex capital construction. I think now they might agree with it, but I've had to fight this police when I said that. So it's an economic thing. I would have it in the menu. I do think solar and wind can do most of what we need done paired with batteries. But from my years of studying energy, I don't like to put all my eggs in one basket. So I like to have even things that I'm not sure are going to end up being used. I'm Um, not against providing some funding to see if they can work better.
Okay, any other questions? All right. Jay? We give our speakers their learning before lunch, our learning before lunch logo umbrella. Okay.
Is this hurricane resistant?
Um, thanks. If y'all didn't notice it ever, in the big UNO parking lot over by the Liberal Arts Building, the first building on campus is a large solar farm, and about a third of the parking lot is solar. So UNO is doing what it can to save money. And thanks, Jay. Just a couple of quick announcements, and Jay will be in the back there. Tom will be selling books and Jay will be signing them. We look forward to seeing you on January 9th. Our speaker will be Kathy Anderson, a harpist and music practitioner, certified music practitioner. We'll talk about the science and research behind therapeutic music. We will reschedule Ron Chapman for later in the spring to talk about the Battle of New Orleans. Thanks for joining us. Happy holidays, Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, Happy Diwali, and all the other winter solstice holidays. Have a good one. Yeah.
Let's just thank you for saying that.